All right, let's talk about conservation and biodiversity. So we don't actually know the full extent of the number of species on Earth. New species are discovered probably every single day. Thousands of new species are described every year. Some really interesting ones. Maybe we've described and named half the species on Earth, and certainly the type of organism makes a difference. So it's very unusual to discover a new bird species or mammal species, but it's quite common to discover new species of frogs and salamanders and plants, and especially fungi and bacteria are probably the most undescribed categories of organisms, just because they're less visible. The amount of biodiversity is related to the temperature and the rainfall. So areas that have both warm temperatures and lots of rain, like tropical forests, are going to contain an enormous amount of biodiversity. Also, areas in the ocean that have lots of sunlight because they're relatively shallow and are near land also tend to be very biodiverse. And human activities are altering that. This image shows a terraced farm here in an area. So conservation biology is interested in many different areas. We're going to talk about only some of what affects conservation biology, including species diversity, environmental causes of loss of diversity, but we're not going to touch on genetic diversity very much of species, but those are there. Human activity does threaten Earth's biodiversity. Of course, there are natural things that also can be catastrophic for biodiversity, including asteroid impacts, large volcanic eruptions. Those things can also cause huge ecosystem disruption and have many times in the past. We'll talk a little bit about mass extinctions when we talk about the evolution of plants and animals in later modules. We are seeing an uptick in the increase in rate of extinction over the last few hundred years. That is considered above the background extinction rate. Of course, humans have been causing extinctions and reducing species diversity for a long time, even before there was industrial humans. Here are some recent extinctions of species. Some of these you might have heard of, some not. American extinction events. The ivory-billed woodpecker went extinct in the 20th century. It was a very large woodpecker species. It looks very much like the small woodpeckers that are around in the Chicago area. Only these were as large as a pigeon, if you can imagine that. But unfortunately, they needed old-growth forest in order to survive. They ate grubs from underneath tree bark, the type of insects that are found in old-growth forests. All the old-growth forests east of the Rocky Mountains have been completely logged, and their last surviving remnant of old-growth forest in northern Georgia was logged in the 1930s to make Singer sewing machine cases. It's a famous example of privately held forest that was completely logged, even though they knew that this was the very last habitat of the ivory-billed woodpecker. And people are still hopeful that maybe we'll rediscover this species, that it will be found. It used to exist in southern Illinois as well, and has not been seen there for a very long time. So habitat loss was the cause of this extinction. The passenger pigeon is probably a more famous example. This went extinct as well in the 20th century, although it was on its way to extinction in the late 19th century. So, and this one was hunted to extinction. And every last one was not hunted out. There were millions and millions of them, and they used to fly in huge flocks all over the eastern United States. And they were hunted for food. People ate them. They were a popular restaurant item, and unfortunately for the passenger pigeon, their whole survival depended on being able to fly around in these huge flocks. So once the huge flocks were decimated and there were only small scattered populations of them, they went extinct. That is still being studied, by the way, why when their population got to a low enough level and people stopped hunting them, they still went extinct. The Caribbean monk seal was hunted to extinction for food by early European sailors. This species is believed to have gone extinct in the 19th century as well. They had no real fear of humans, and so they were extremely easy to catch. The sailors could literally just walk right up to them. And they were a good food source, unfortunately for them. The Carolina parakeet was another victim of logging of the old growth forest. So Carolina parakeet existed, of course, in the Carolinas, but also Florida and Georgia and Alabama and places where there was old growth forest. Well, as that was slowly logged out, the Carolina parakeet went extinct, unfortunately. And there is not really any hope that they will be found again. Although there are related species that still exist, and there are some introduced species which could take over the niche of the Carolina parakeet, like the monk parakeet, which has established itself in wild populations all over in the eastern United States. The passenger pigeon's niche has been taken over by the starling, by the European starling, which now is all over the place. It has a slightly different niche than the passenger pigeon, but they are everywhere by the millions. They're not quite as numerous as the passenger pigeon was, but they're getting close. We have been causing extinctions for a long time. Often people think that only modern industrial humans are capable of causing extinctions, but actually ancient humans, as we expanded and traveled around the planet early in our history, also caused many species to go extinct. So our species originated in Africa about 250,000 years ago. Some people are pushing that back now to about 300,000 years ago is when our modern species, Homo sapiens, first appeared. But ancestral species in Africa were hunting before that. As far back as about 3 million years ago, there were human ancestors who were starting to hunt. And that's when we see the populations and the abundance of huntable size species starting to decline. Species that are between about 20 pounds and 200 pounds in weight are humans' favorite size for hunting. So those populations start to decline in Africa about 3 million years ago, but never had that huge extinction event. So about 18% of large mammal genera go extinct, probably due to human hunting. Maybe. We're not that sure about it. Then the first place that we migrated was Europe and Asia and Australia. And in Eurasia, numerous large species go extinct as soon as our species showed up. In Australia, also, 88% of the large mammals go extinct as soon as our species showed up, about 45,000 years ago. New Zealand as well, which are those large islands that are near Australia. Flightless birds, moas, and other birds, including a very large species of eagle, one of the largest species ever to exist, go extinct after humans showed up there. And these were not industrial humans. These were, the native populations that are still there today. Madagascar, North America, South America, many species go extinct as soon as our species shows up. And although there is some debate amongst anthropologist, was this due to actually exclusively due to human hunting, or was it due to an environmental change? Because the environment was changing when humans showed up in North and South America. Between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, the environment was changing. We were shifting out of a glacial period into a warmer interglacial. Some cold grassland ecosystems disappeared completely. Is that why that these populations went extinct? But we'll talk about some of these. So we've always had an impact on the environment. Our species has always had an impact on the environment, and we are also an extremely mobile species and able to get around the world. And this is an ancient thing that we've done, not something that's just modern industrial humans doing. Some really interesting flightless birds, unfortunately, were hunted to extinction. Some in prehistoric times, some not until the last 1,000 years. The moas in New Zealand were these huge birds. This, of course, is not an actual moa, but it is a stuffed reconstruction of what one looked like. They didn't even have wings at all. There were numerous species of moa that lived in New Zealand and Australia. They all went extinct within, estimates are within a few thousand years of humans showing up, extinct. And we know that humans both ate the eggs and ate the birds. The elephant bird of Madagascar, this one went extinct relatively recently, probably about 800 years ago, was hunted to extinction. There are numerous fossilized eggs and shells and bones because they went extinct relatively recently. They even appear in some stories, some human stories. They were originally thought to be completely mythological, like the unicorn, and then remains were discovered. But in mythology, they're referred to as the roc or the roc, R-O-C. So if you've ever read any stories that featured this mythological huge bird, it wasn't always mythological. The dodo went extinct the most recently out of these. The dodo were a flightless turkey-sized bird that lived on the island of Mauritius, and sailors discovered this island in the 1700s as a fantastic source of food. And these birds as well, they lived on an island with no predators. So they were completely fearless. They had not evolved any fear of predators and didn't recognize humans as a threat. And the sailors could just walk right up to them and grab these birds, these turkey-sized birds. So they've been extinct for over 100 years as well. So some of these North American mammals that went extinct, sometimes these are called megafauna, mega for large, because they were huge, like the giant sloth, which was 8 or 9 feet tall, went extinct shortly after humans arrived. The steppe horse as well went extinct. So horses first evolved in North America, migrated to the rest of the world from there, but then went extinct in North America. And they went extinct about 10,000 years ago after our species showed up. And they were not reintroduced to North America until the Spanish showed up, and some of their horses were either released or escaped. And we have wild horses today, many generations of several hundred years of wild horses living in especially western U.S. states. And so that kind of argues against the ecologic change hypothesis of extinction, that if the Yukon horse went extinct because of ecological changes due to the warming climate, why did they so easily readapt to living in that same environment as soon as a few Spanish horses escaped? So it seems like the Yukon horse is a very likely one that was hunted to extinction. And we do know that humans in North America, ancient humans, did hunt all these species because we find their butchered remains with cut marks on bones and things indicating that they were being hunted. Mammoths went extinct every place humans were, and interestingly, dwarf mammoths have been found to have only gone extinct on a few islands where humans never made it a few hundred years ago, 400 years ago, something like that. So the idea that mammoths may have had a double whammy ecological change due to the warming climate and then being hunted by the newly arrived species, our species. There was also a pig-like animal called a tapir, the California tapir, that also disappeared around the same time, about 10,000 years ago. And again, this of course is not a photograph of an actual California tapir because that species went extinct 10,000 years ago, but this is a very similar species that looks very much like them that still lives in the area. So since then, wild pigs have been reintroduced to California and have done extremely well. Russian boars were brought over. There are also wild pigs that still existed further south in Mexico that have made their way north. So there are currently thousands of wild pigs living in California. So the idea, again, that this species went extinct because of environmental change doesn't seem likely, since they have a similar species has been successfully reintroduced kind of accidentally. So, but it's still, this is a hot topic actually in anthropology, is did humans cause the extinctions, or was it all environment, or was it a combination of the two things? So when we're talking about biodiversity, there's three main levels of biodiversity. One is on an individual level, genetic diversity. And so this means within, if we compare different individuals, if we take DNA samples from a bunch of different individuals in a population, how similar are they? Are they all really closely genetically related, which would be bad? That would indicate there's been a lot of inbreeding. If they're all really genetically diverse, that's a good sign of a healthy population. So that's one of the things we're interested in. Species diversity in an area. So how many different species are there? Are there 50 species of trees in this particular area? Are there 1,000 different species of trees in this area? That's species diversity. Ecosystem diversity means in this area, whatever area we're talking about, how many different ecosystems are there? Is there a lake? Okay, there's a lake ecosystem. Are there tall trees? Okay, then there's a canopy ecosystem and a ground level ecosystem. How many different ecosystems are in the area? Is there a mountain? Well, at the base of the mountain, there's going to be one kind of ecosystem. As you go up, especially if it's very tall, you're going to end up with colder and colder climate, and the ecosystems that you find are going to be different. So a small mountainous range might have huge ecosystem diversity just because of the different microclimates that are present all over the place. So those are different things that we consider when we're trying to figure out if there is biodiversity in a particular area. And this image here is an example of biodiversity loss by losing subspecies. So that would be genetic diversity. So all of these different tigers here that are listed are subspecies of tigers that have, some of which are gone. So like the Caspian tiger, completely extinct. This was the furthest west existing tiger. Of course, where tigers are the most numerous today is still in India. That's the Bengal tiger. And this shows you even the contraction of the range. So the orange is where they historically existed a few hundred years ago, and the red are where these exist today. So even within India, where Bengal tigers are doing very well, where they exist, their range has contracted into these fragmented reserves. Javan tiger, island of Java, extinct as well. The island of Bali used to have its own subspecies of tiger. They've been extinct for over 100 years. Indochina tiger, still around, but with a smaller range. South China tiger, very endangered. Not very many left. Siberian tiger doing better. They've been well protected, and luckily for them, they live in areas where there isn't as much pressure by large human populations. So doing better. So this would be an example of loss of genetic diversity of one species. So if you lose subspecies, then you lose genetic diversity. So a population, remember, is a single species, and one whole species could be fragmented into a bunch of small populations that may or may not be connected by immigration and emigration as a metapopulation. So if the population is small, it's going to lose genetic diversity in two ways. It's going to lose genetic diversity because there's going to be inbreeding, and it's going to lose genetic diversity just by genetic drift, because some individuals are going to get eaten by predators and they're not going to reproduce. So if you have a small population, every generation you're going to lose some genetic diversity unless there's immigration and emigration to other populations. Species diversity. If we have a healthy ecosystem, hopefully we will have lots of different kinds of species, different plant species, different animal species, different kinds of insect species. That's a healthy ecosystem. If you eliminate one species, it could have effects on many species, not just that one species being lost. Ecosystem diversity is also important. Like, let's say one type of ecosystem in a particular area is going to be destroyed. Maybe the forest ecosystem is going to be destroyed because of logging, or maybe the grassland ecosystem is going to be destroyed because it's going to be turned into a wheat field. That any part of that ecosystem, one of the ecosystems is no longer there, that's losing ecosystem diversity. So genetic diversity can be maintained in a few different ways. One, you can have a huge number of individuals in a population. If that's the case, like in the human population, we have genetic diversity because we are an enormous population. You can also have small populations that have immigration and emigration between them. What you lose when you don't have genetic diversity is the ability to be selected by natural selection. So if you have a large, diverse population, like let's say of these beetles here, if there's an environmental change, if there's a predator has a preference for one particular coloration, then the entire population is not in danger of extinction because there's variety in a population. There's variation in a population. If there's a disease, for example, that strikes these beetles, or a parasitic mite of some kind attacks these, if they have genetic diversity, it's less likely that the whole species is going to be affected equally. But if you have a small inbred population that's all very genetically similar, a disease or a parasite, they're all equally vulnerable. You could wipe out the whole species. So species diversity is the number of species. This is something that the Endangered Species Act is directly trying to address by protecting particular species. And that's also a way of protecting the ecosystem, because if an endangered species lives, the only place it lives is in one particular environment, that whole environment is protected. That whole ecosystem is protected because it has an endangered species in it. And this has caused a lot of conflict even between private landholders and the government. This was something that was reversed during the previous presidential administration. The protection of the Endangered Species Act was eliminated temporarily. It has been restored. So now endangered species are now protected again. A threatened species means that it's in danger of becoming endangered. So a threatened species means that its habitat is in danger, its numbers are declining, or both of those things. An endangered species means that the numbers are low enough, or there's so little habitat left, that if something doesn't change, it's going to go extinct. That's what endangered means. It's going to go extinct if something doesn't change. Here are two examples of extinctions that have been reversed due to the activity of conservationists. Whooping cranes were critically in danger just 20 years ago. And because of habitat protection and active breeding of whooping crane chicks, and then re-releasing them into the wild, their numbers are increasing right now for the first time in a long time. California condors were brought back from the brink of extinction by a captive breeding program where they were, all the existing California condors, which their numbers got, I can't remember the exact number, but it was below 50. It's like 29 or something. California condors were the last of their species. They were all captured, brought into captivity, and a captive breeding program has increased their numbers to over 1,000 now, and many of them have been re-released back into the wild, and they're now protected. The biggest danger to them was accidental poisonings by ranchers who were poisoning mice and rats and things, and coyotes, poisoning coyotes that were attacking their livestock. And the condors are, of course, scavengers. They're vultures. Condors are huge vultures. And they're were eating the dead carcasses, the poisoned carcasses, and getting killed themselves. We know the most about these big noticeable species. So every habitat where there is a large visible species that's being protected, there are probably a lot of other species in the same habitat that no one has noticed are threatened or endangered, and they are protected as well if the whole environment is protected. These are two more species that your textbook has a little bit about that are critically endangered. The Philippine eagle is a forest hunting tropical eagle. They're very pretty, as you can see. Critically endangered, very few left. They're being very intensely monitored. The Yangtze River dolphin in China, there's actually some bad news about them last year. Not a single one was sighted. They live in very murky water, however, and they're still hoping that they're not actually extinct yet, but they're a rare freshwater dolphin. There aren't very many freshwater cetaceans in the world, and this is one of them. So hopefully they're not actually extinct, although they could be what they call functionally extinct, meaning there's not enough genetic diversity left in the few individuals that are remaining alive that the species can survive. We just don't know. And I'm not sure if there are any in captivity that could be used as part of a breeding program. It's kind of hard to keep dolphins in captivity compared to birds are much easier to keep in captivity and have a breeding program. So human activity has affected particular ecosystems much more than others. Wetlands have been affected because they were thought to be garbage land, and that the best thing you could do with a swamp or a marsh was to drain it and turn it into farmland. And so that was done not just in the United States, but in Canada and in Mexico and other places around the world. And now we recognize that, in fact, wetlands are very beneficial to humans. And draining all the wetlands for farmland has not been a good idea. One word that was coined by Wilson, what was his first name? He wrote a book called Biophilia. Biophilia means human love of living things. And E.O. Wilson, that's his name. He wrote a book about 20 years ago called Biophilia, tracing the fact that all through human history, humans have always expressed an appreciation for nature, for wildlife, for forests, for the ocean. We can recognize the value of biodiversity just on its own for its own sake, not because it necessarily benefits us directly, although it does. But I think we can argue to people, to most people who live near biodiverse areas, that preserving that just for beauty's sake is worthwhile, even if they can't think of a reason why it directly benefits us. But we'll talk about some of the benefits of a biodiverse ecosystem to us directly if we need a reason. One of the benefits is the genetic diversity related to our domestic crops and animals. So almost all of our domesticated crops and animals have a wild counterpart. And that's important because if a new disease happens, we can crossbreed them with wild varieties that are resistant, or now we can even just take that gene for resistance and put it right into a domestic variety. And this has been done many times for, most recently that I can think of, for rice. There was a fungus that was infecting rice plants, and they found a wild rice in Japan that was resistant to it, and they were able to take the gene and use that. So, and most of our most of our domestic animals as well, the wild counterpart of that domestic species still exists in the wild somewhere, including for chickens and ducks and sheep, goats. Not for cattle, though. The wild cattle that our domestic cattle were domesticated from is extinct. It has been extinct for probably about 1,000 years. But that's an important reason to preserve wild areas, to preserve the wild counterparts of our domestic plant species and animal species. We make a lot of medicines from chemicals that are found in wild, mostly plants, although there's a few animals as well. For example, there's a very popular, I shouldn't call it popular, extensively used chemotherapy drug that was originally found from the rosy periwinkle plant. Now it's made synthetically, but it was originally from a wild plant. And that's true for many of these. So 25% of prescription drugs today contain substances that were originally identified in plants, although if it's something that's going to be used extensively, it's more economic to develop a way to make it synthetically. That's cheaper than growing and harvesting wild plants. Some medicines you might have heard of that were originally from wild plants. A more recent one would be Taxol, which is used in the treatment of breast cancer. Originally, when it first came on the market about 50 years ago, it was harvested from the Pacific yew tree, but now it's made synthetically. The foxglove flowers used to be used for making digitalis, which is a heart stimulant. So people who have heart failure are often prescribed digitalis. It makes your heart beat more strongly. Now, of course, also synthetic. Opium poppies are the source of morphine and all its derivatives, including heroin and all those pain-relieving drugs. It is the most powerful pain-relieving substance that we currently have. Of course, it has a lot of problems. It's addictive, and it suppresses breathing, which, you know, it causes overdose deaths. We don't have anything good to replace it yet, but that was originally the derivative of the opium poppy, and much of it today is still made from real poppies that are grown and harvested, although there's also a synthetic, it's made synthetically as well, which is what fentanyl is. Fentanyl is synthetic morphine. Aspirin, which was an older pain reliever, has been around for hundreds of years, was originally derived from the bark of the willow tree. Now it's made completely synthetically. It's derived from salicylic acid, which is really common in a lot of plants, but it was concentrated in higher quantities in willow, which is why it was originally derived from there. But we don't get it from willow trees anymore. It's now made synthetically. There are some Some things from animals as well. Probably the most important one is horseshoe crab blood, which is blue. And for over 20 years, it was the best method that we had for detecting bacterial contamination in prescription drugs and in blood. Happily for the horseshoe crabs, we now have a synthetic version of this, and we don't need to use the horseshoe crabs anymore. But horseshoe crabs happily are really abundant and have not been put into any kind of threatened or endangered status because of being used in this manner. But they're being phased out as the synthetic becomes more available. There are two possibilities for replacing the pain-killing qualities of morphine. There's a rainforest frog that secretes a toxin in its skin. Poison dart frogs, which I mentioned when we were talking about warning coloration. They make all kinds of interesting compounds in their skin that are poisonous and toxic, but sometimes those can have good effects as well in the right combination. And so that's being explored as a painkiller as well. There was a great hopes placed on a toxin that's made by cone snails, which are predatory sea snails. It hasn't worked out as well as they thought, but the cone snails make a really powerful painkiller which doesn't suppress breathing, and so there were high hopes that we could come up with something that worked as well as morphine but didn't cause overdose deaths. It's not ready for human trials though yet, but this is a reason for preserving and studying biodiversity, because if the rainforest frogs go extinct, we won't be able to get any more of the compounds that they might have that are beneficial to us. An intact ecosystem also provides benefit to humans who live nearby in many ways. Water percolating through wetlands or tropical forests can be cleaned. Soil organisms are mostly doing that work. There was a city in Northern California that couldn't afford to build a new sewage treatment plant, so instead they just started letting all their sewage flow through this marsh that was nearby, and it actually worked better than a sewage treatment plant for cleaning it's a small city, cleaning their city sewage before it went out into the ocean. So that's a benefit. Crop pollination, wild bees do some of the work of pollinating, especially trees for crops like almonds and apples. Pest control for crops as well. Many pests attack our agricultural crops, and often the wild species that live in nearby areas can keep those to a minimum by being predators on those. Soil preservation, so an intact ecosystem maintains and increases the depth of the topsoil. When you farm an area, the soil becomes degraded, the topsoil is blown away, washed away, becomes thinner and thinner, but nearby areas that have not been turned into farms can have intact and growing topsoil. Moderation of weather extremes. This one, probably the best example would have been Hurricane Katrina, which had a direct hit on extremely low-lying areas that are part of the Mississippi River Delta. And much of that had been degraded by, because wetlands are being deliberately destroyed and taking away the mangrove forest and other bayou environment there made the impact of Hurricane Katrina on Louisiana worse. So they're now in the process of remediating that and trying to reverse some of what they did before that hurricane hit. The threats to biodiversity, number one by far is habitat loss. And the habitat loss could be from human farming, from human just habitation, building houses and cities, from logging. So there's many different ways that we can damage habitat. In the ocean habitat, you know, we have plastic waste destroying habitat. We have trawling, the bottom fishing, that's destroying habitat. So it's not just terrestrial habitat, marine habitat as well. Introduced species. Humans, we are a mobile species, and we bring species with us accidentally or on purpose. And I'll show you a few examples of introduced species. Introduced species don't always become a problem. Introduced species sometimes, you might see them here and there, but they don't cause any problems. But we'll talk about some ones that have become problems. Overharvesting, this is mostly, we're talking about wild populations here. So overharvesting wild populations, mostly for food, but also for the medicine trade or pet trade is also a problem. And global climate, which we already talked about a little bit. So loss of habitat is the #1 threat to species. We talked about a couple of species already that went extinct because of habitat loss. The ivory-billed woodpecker would be one of those, the Carolina parakeet, another one that went extinct, not because humans were hunting them, but because they lost their habitat. Human activity can also cause fragmentation of habitat. Our roads, you know, we build these huge, you know, 6-lane wide highways that fragments a habitat and separates populations from each other that perhaps used to be one continuous population. Now they are multiple small isolated populations, which individually would be more likely to go extinct. So fragmenting habitat. So with prairie is grassland, remember, that's what we call grassland in North America. Because it was so desirable as farmland, prairie has been pretty much destroyed and turned to farmland. And the little patches that remain are very far apart and very fragmented. So that makes all the species that live there more likely to go extinct. Because if you have a small population, that means inbreeding is going to occur, and that makes it more difficult. Unless you're actively moving organisms from one fragmented population to another, extinction could occur. So what we call arable land, that's suffered the most. So arable land, the most desirable for farmland is temperate grassland. And you can see worldwide, 75% of temperate grassland is gone. And it's gone to farmland and gone to suburbs. Here in the Chicago suburbs, this used to be mostly tall grass prairie and some forest. It's been completely lost as an ecosystem. So that's why so many people, if they're trying to make their yard more natural, they plant prairie plants because that's mostly what used to be here. Chaparral, remember that's that Mediterranean kind of climate. Chaparral is a little bit on the dry side, so the type of crops that will grow there are somewhat limited, but wheat does really well in chaparral. So that's one of the crops that will grow there. Temperate deciduous forest is a little bit less desirable to be completely converted to farm because you have to clear trees in order to farm there, but it does have a lot of rainfall. Remember, if you've got trees, you've got rain. Trees need a lot of rain. So this has been less destroyed, 55% worldwide. Has been destroyed, and probably more of it has been destroyed just for logging than for converting it into farmland. Tropical dry forest as well. This is logged for the timber and as well often turned into plantations because it's got rain, right? Savanna as well, this is converted to farmland as well, often with irrigation. If you're going to grow crops in chaparral are sometimes irrigated as well. In savanna is often irrigated. Desert as well. We grow crops in the desert, but it has to be massively irrigated, which you'll see if you go to some of the desert areas in the United States that are massively farmed, like Southern California and Arizona. You will see massive irrigation apparatus for watering those crops. Tropical rainforest, Mostly this is logging and conversion to plantations, like banana plantations, papaya plantations. Temperate rainforest, pretty intact, not much loss there. Boreal forest, you notice almost no loss. This is most of the boreal forest that's been lost is just because of people logging for timber and living there, because you can't farm that area and you can't farm tundra either. So almost zero loss there. Introduced species, so this, when we call something an introduced species, we mean humans introduced it. So either intentionally, because it was an ornamental plant or desirable in some way, escaped pets, or it was introduced completely accidentally. Both things happen all the time because as we move around, we bring species with us. And the problem with an introduced species, and like I said, introduced doesn't mean invasive. Many introduced species just kind of hang around at a low level. They never really cause any problem. They're just another species in the ecosystem now. But without having their native predators or parasites, sometimes introduced species become the dominant species in an ecosystem and can cause other species to go extinct. Because remember, we can't have two species competing exactly for the same niche. If that's the case, one is going to go extinct. We're not going to have two species competing for exactly the same resources for long. We're going to talk more about the cane toad, which was introduced without too much problem to Hawaii, weirdly, because Hawaii has a lot of invasive species that are causing harm, but not the cane toad. But in Australia, the introduction of the cane toad was devastating and continues to be devastating to this day. It's a huge problem. Burmese python in Florida, these are escaped pets. They weren't introduced deliberately. People buy pythons as pets and they start to get too big and people let them go into the Everglades where they don't exist naturally and they're causing all sorts of problems down there. And one of the biggest problems with pythons is how large they are, that they are a danger to pets and small people, and they're also a danger to native animals who there's no huge snakes in the ecosystem naturally down there. We've been dealing with the emerald ash borer here in the Midwest for the last 10 years or so. This was introduced from Asia. Accidentally came over in wood pallets. Luckily, though, it only kills ash trees. If it had the ability to destroy related species, we would be in big trouble because there's really no good way to get rid of it. It's caused almost all of the ash trees in the Chicago area to be killed and have to be removed from suburban areas and in the city as well. No good way to stop that one. Hopefully it'll just, once it kills all the ash trees, it'll die out and then we can replant ash trees because it'll be gone. This is an interesting one. This is a problem not in Illinois because it's too cold here in the winter for this plant to survive. It's an ornamental plant called kudzu that's native to Japan. It was introduced as an ornamental garden plant in the southeastern United States. And it took off. It's a viney, fast-growing plant. And what you see in this image here, this is a forest. And these little humps here, those are trees that have been overgrown by kudzu. It'll cover houses, hedges, whole trees. It just grows over them and smothers them. It can grow a foot a day. It doesn't have any native, there's no North American species that eat it. But goats eat it, apparently. So farmers are who have a problem with kudzu invading their property are buying goats to try to control it because goats will eat anything. And they can eat anything because of their ruminant stomachs, which we'll talk about in a future chapter. The next biggest threat is overharvesting. And remember, you hear the word harvest and you think crops, but overharvesting, we're talking about harvesting of wild organisms. So fishing, wild species, hunting, harvesting for the pet trade of both plants and animals. Plants are harvested as ornamentals, like orchids are threatened by overharvesting. So species that have a restricted habitat, especially ones that have low reproductive rates, like whales, are really vulnerable to overharvesting and could take a really long time to recover. African elephants are one of those species that is continuing to decline in spite of the fact that international trade in ivory has been restricted. There's still a market for illegal ivory, and that's causing African elephants to be continued to be harvested. It's even resulted in a little bit of natural selection in African elephants. They're seeing now in surviving elephants decreased tusk size because poachers don't go for the ones that have smaller tusks. So they use their tusks to fend off large predators like lions and also to fight with other elephants. And now the population, there seems to be some natural selection going on for smaller and smaller tusks. They have even been spotted. Numerous adult females have been spotted with no tusks at all. And that means they won't be killed by poachers. So that may be where this species is heading. New molecular biology techniques have helped the identification of species. For example, if something is a carved ivory figurine, it still has elephant DNA in it, and samples can be taken to identify whether it's really from an elephant or whether it's from the bone of some other species. This has also been used, DNA analysis has also been used to figure out what whales are still being harvested. Whale meat is really popular still in certain countries, like in Japan, and DNA analysis can indicate whether the meat is from a species that's endangered and protected, or whether it's from one of the species where minimal hunting is still allowed. Overfishing is a huge problem in the last 150 years, and it's really since industrial fishing has happened. Until around 1920, 1930, fishing was all done without the help of diesel engines. Fishing vessels were steam powered, or were before that had sails, and so they were limited in how much they could harvest. And the era of industrial fishing has really decimated wild fish populations, and many of them are protected. Fishing is restricted in very many areas, but people violate those fishing restrictions. There was a researcher recently who went back and looked at old descriptions of fishing populations, because really we didn't have any population estimates of fishing populations before 1950. That's when people started to be concerned about declining fish populations and started trying to estimate the world population size, or the population size in a particular area of different species that humans eat. And this researcher went back and looked at old literature back all the way to the 1600s of descriptions by sailors of what they saw when they were fishing. And he said the decimation of fish populations has been even greater than we have any idea, because by the time people started paying attention and counting, trying to count and estimate fish populations, it had already been decimated by 90%. And so what we're seeing today is a very tiny, tiny sample of what wild fish populations used to be. He had found descriptions where people said that schools of fish were so abundant that you couldn't even see the surface of the water. All you could see was roiling fish populations for as far as the eye could see. that sea turtles were so numerous in the Caribbean that it felt like you could walk a mile to shore by just walking on the backs of turtles, because all the turtles trying to beach themselves and lay eggs during breeding season were so abundant. And he said it sounds ridiculous today, but he said there's so many different authors and so many people writing similar descriptions. He said it has to be a true description of what it was like hundreds of years ago. And no wonder people weren't worried about overfishing then. Another threat to environments is acid rain. This threat, happily, at least in North America, is much less than it was 50 years ago. Acid rain comes from burning fossil fuels, mostly coal, secondarily oil for coal, like coal-fired power plants, and also oil for home heating, which isn't a very big deal in Illinois. Hardly anybody has oil heat. But in New England and also in the Northwest, having an oil tank and having your winter heat come from oil is still pretty common. So acid rain, it could be any kind of precipitation. It could be rain or snow. And it's from particles and chemicals that are in the burned result of burning coal and oil that end up reacting with water and forming two acids. So coal especially can have a lot of sulfur in it, and that you might have heard, you know, dirty coal and clean coal. Clean coal, that means it has less sulfur. It still has sulfur, but it has less sulfur. And when sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides are released into the air, because of course fossil fuels are former organic matter, and organic matter has nitrogen and sulfur in it because proteins have nitrogen and sulfur. Then it forms sulfuric acid and nitric acid, and this can significantly lower the pH of water and the soil, which we'll talk more about the damage that causes plants when we get to the plant section. So, but basically, if there's too many hydrogen ions around, which is when things are more acidic, that means there's more free hydrogen ions, that prevents plants from taking up certain nutrients, especially calcium, which means if they don't have calcium, conifers especially can die in the winter and freeze. It also kills fish, so reduces species diversity in lakes. This has improved enormously. In the 1970s, acid rain and acid deforestation and acid lakes and ponds was a huge problem. It's way less. 1972, 74, early 70s, the Clean Air Act was passed. And the Clean Air Act restricted how much sulfur could be emitted by coal-fired power plants. It forced them to put scrubbers in their smokestacks to remove the sulfur. Made a huge difference. Acid rain is still an issue, but way less. You probably haven't even heard anybody talking about it recently. But whenever you hear about, you know, what do we need the Clean Air Act for? Oh, it's restricting business. We need to loosen up regulations. That's one of the possible consequences of loosening up regulations, is that we will go back to the situation that we had in the 1970s with acid rain killing whole lakefuls of fish in certain areas. So when we're thinking about conservation for a population, we want to think about the population size. How big can this population be in this particular area? What is the carrying capacity of some particular environment that we're looking at? Is that population size going to allow for enough genetic diversity? Can we improve the genetic diversity by importing individuals from another population? And what habitat is critical for this species to survive? Does it need old-growth forest? So the two approaches that we'll talk about, the small population approach, this focuses on population size, and declining population approach that hasn't gotten to a really small population yet, but we can see that the population is declining. What can we do in terms of habitat conservation, especially if the population is declining. So the small population approach, this is where we already have a small population that's endangered or threatened. It's very much in jeopardy of extinction if we have a small population, because a disease, a large, even a natural event like a hurricane could destroy and wipe out a population once it has gotten to a small population. This is a threatened species. In the American Northwest, the northern spotted owl, it lives in forested areas, especially old growth forest areas that are very desirable to loggers. But happily, it is only threatened now because its habitat has been preserved thanks to the Endangered Species Act. This caused some conflict with private companies about 20 years ago, but happily it has been resolved. We call this reduction in population size that leads to worse and worse problems for a species, the extinction vortex. So a vortex is a spiral. So once a population is declining and getting smaller, new problems can happen because it's a small population. Namely, genetic variation is going to be reduced. Once you have a small population, you have more inbreeding. Once you have inbreeding, you have less variation in individuals, which means they're more vulnerable to a single disease or single event. You also have less ability to adapt to environmental change. So if the individuals in your population are all genetically very similar, and the environment changes, there's no individual there that's going to be genetically different and be able to survive. But if you have a large population with a variety of different genetic types, the environment changes, some of them may survive. So this is the extinction vortex. So you have a small population, you get inbreeding. A small population, you can also have genetic drift, which means just by chance some alleles are going to disappear every generation if you have a small population. That's genetic drift. Like, just think about you with your own family. So if you have, let's say there's 2 or 3 kids in your family. Now, all of you kids together didn't get all the alleles that your parents have. There could be alleles that one of your parents has that just by chance didn't get passed down to the next generation. That's genetic drift. When you have a small population, alleles are going to disappear just by chance. So that's loss of genetic variability, which means lower fitness. Once you get a lot of inbreeding and you have a lot of loci where the individual is homozygous, you have less, that's lower fitness. Deleterious recessive alleles are going to show more and be expressed. You have more genetic disorders when you have inbreeding. Lower reproductive success, higher mortality, and then you get an even smaller population. And I have the cheetah here as an example because this is one that surprised scientists. Cheetahs apparently went through a population bottleneck sometime in the last 1,000 years. We don't know exactly what happened. But even though their population didn't seem to be that small, genetically, they were all really closely related, which was alarming that even though there were thousands of cheetahs spread over numerous populations, they were all really closely related to each other, and so they were all inbreeding. And that implies that sometime in the past, hundreds of years ago, cheetahs went through one of these extinction vortexes, but they didn't quite go extinct. Instead, they had a small population and they reproduced and expanded back again from that small population. But what that means is cheetahs today are really vulnerable because they don't have much genetic variability. But scientists and conservationists are trying to address that by moving cheetahs around. So they've been doing genetic testing on cheetahs all over Africa, and they've been moving cheetahs from different populations around to try to increase the genetic diversity of every population of cheetahs. and they've been moderately successful. Cheetahs are easier to handle than leopards or lions. Not quite as dangerous to humans. And there's not as many of them, so it's easier to address. But they're an animal that went through this before humans became aware and paid any attention to that. What was the reason for their lowered population? Possibly human hunting. We don't really know. They used to be popular pets at one point. So small populations don't always lead to extinction, as we see with the cheetahs. We just call that a population bottleneck. It lowers genetic diversity, but cheetahs are, with some human help, it looks like they're doing all right now. Another population that went through an extreme bottleneck were elephant seals, and I have a link here to a YouTube video showing elephant seals. If you've never seen them, they're actually kind of funny. They live all over the west coast of the United States in isolated areas, and they were hunted for meat, and also their blubber was used for oil, for lamp oil. And they were reduced down to only about 20 individuals by 1890. So they were very much in danger of extinction with only 20 individuals. But despite the fact that they're have very low genetic diversity, they're doing very well today. And they're called elephant seals because of this kind of floppy nose that the males have. So these individuals here, these are all males. I can tell by their floppy nose, and they kind of make this gurgly, weird call through their nose. If you've never seen them, I suggest you watch this video. If you want to see elephant seals in person, if you ever go to California, there's a reserve, a California state reserve called Año Nuevo, where there are thousands of elephant seals, and depending on what time of year you go, there might be only a few adults, there might be hundreds of females giving birth. One year I went there during, oh, look at how I spelled elephant. Oh, I have to fix that. One year when I went there, I actually got to see a baby seal being born. It was very cool, but you have to time it right. Of course, they have people, employees there, docents, who keep people from bothering the seals. They won't let you get very close to the seals. Okay, so we'll come back, and the next one we'll talk more about preventing extinctions, some good stories in conservation, some positive stories in conservation in the next video.